Welcome to Rights and Remedies, the podcast where we explore the law, the fight for justice, and healing. I'm Allison Mahoney, your host and a lawyer dedicated to fighting for the rights of survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, as well as children harmed by the child welfare system. Each week, we delve into legal battles and court cases, share powerful stories that demand change, and spotlight the cutting-edge practices that are helping victims on their journey to healing. So, if you're ready to dive into the intersection of advocacy and healing, subscribe to Rights and Remedies today. New episodes are released weekly, and we can't wait to have you join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference. Welcome back to Rights and Remedies. Before we begin today's episode, please be advised that we'll be discussing trauma and sexual abuse, which may be triggering for some listeners. If you need to take a break or just skip this episode, please do so and prioritize your own well-being. Today, our guest is Kahila Hedayatzadeh. She's the founder of the Thriving Woman Institute, and she's a relationship therapist and coach. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Very excited to have you. Thank you for taking the
Yes.
time. Can you tell us what the Thriving Woman Institute is? Sounds
Sure. Yeah,
very
I started it
off
back
the
in,
name.
I'm sorry.
But it sounds very exciting just based on the name alone.
Thank you. It was funny. I was looking for the name for my private practice for a couple months, and this just kind of came to me as, all we are trying to do in life is really learn how to thrive. We've been in survival mode for so long. And as I go through my journey of being a practitioner and, just being myself on my own healing journey, I'm like, do I also want more than to just thrive in life? I want to feel alive. So the Thriving Woman Institute is really allowing in women to come in to really heal from past wounds and learn how to thrive and feel alive in all parts of their lives, whether it's in their career, their relationships, and even in the lifestyle that we have for ourselves. So that's kind of where the name came from. It was more personal, honestly, and it was more of a journey of all the clients that I've had so far. And I'm like, yes, thriving. That's what we want.
When did you
Yeah.
start the organization?
2017. I've been in the mental health field for about 10 years now and worked in nonprofits and for-profits and worked with children. I started my work with children who were abused, whether it was sexual, mental, physical abuse. And that was pretty disheartening to say the least, as you know, and you mentioned earlier in the podcast about the trigger warnings. And working with the sexually abused children and the thought of sending them back to environments where they were not protected, and they were not even listened to or believed was something that really broke my heart. And so, I set out to learn more about what trauma does to us and how we can overcome it as a society. But the more I got into the field and kind of the politics that prevent us in the mental health field to actually help people overcome those traumas, it just didn't sit well with my value system. So I started my own practice and really focused on learning more, diving deeper into learning about traumas and relational wounds that we encounter in our lives. And unfortunately, none of us got away away from traumas or any sort of relational wounds. We all have it. So,
That is
yeah, but
that is true. I have so many questions. I think an easy one
sure.
to start is do you focus on working with adults now, or do you still work with children?
I do. I work with adults now solely. And, I started my practice working with women only. The last year or so, I've started working with men quite a bit too, as I've seen so much loneliness in the male community. And obviously, they have a lot of trauma as well, but they don't talk about it. So I do a lot of men's group. But yeah, all adults, there are some parents that I have in whether it's one-on-one or some of my groups that I have. And if they need advice, I'll guide them once in a while, but I usually ask them to bring the kids to another therapist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you work with people in any specific geographic area or all over the country?
All over. The coaching umbrella basically allows me to be able to work with people all over the world. I have clients in London, in Netherlands, Nigeria. So it's really fun to be able to work with everyone, and especially cultural differences too. I grew up in two different countries before I moved to the States. So that helps me kind of understand that societal beliefs and cultural beliefs really impact us even deeper
Yeah.
and our
Yeah.
traumas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned traditional therapy models and
Mm.
wanting to depart, at least in some fashion, from that. Can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Sure, sure. At no point am I disrespecting my field or the people who work so hard in it. I'm just a very determined individual in the way I look at coming to therapy and healing with insurance companies, with the limitations that we have in how we can treat people. And a lot of the individuals in our field haven't really been trained on trauma focused therapy or relational therapy. And of course, that is a huge part of who we are as human beings. And so for me, I didn't want to be told how to treat people and the limitations of sessions that we had with insurance companies. So, and again, I have a background with my mom who was a cancer patient, and I really dug deeper into understanding kind of why our physical body is influenced with our mental, emotional health, and even the spiritual
Yeah.
parts of us. And again, those conversations aren't really happening in the field as a normal dialogue and
Mhm.
conversation. So being a rebel that I am, was like, okay, I'm going to do my own thing and just kind of do coaching. Obviously, I use all my therapeutic skills and the foundation and the tools that I have, but I also really hold my clients accountable to do the work. Right.
Mhm.
There's only so much that I could do for everyone in every session, but we're also responsible after session to learn how to become our own therapists. So that's really kind of the coaching component that comes in, where I really push them in a sense to hold themselves accountable. And I give them homework and come back to session. It's like, all right, how was it? What worked, what didn't? So for me, the way I look at it is that we're not meant to be in therapy for the rest of our lives. We
Mhm.
are coming to therapy to heal the parts that need to heal, but also really give ourselves that respect and compassion and awareness to say, yeah, life is going to happen, but I have the whereabouts and the skill sets to get myself through it.
Right. And creating that sense of autonomy is so important. Are you
Absolutely.
seeing different outcomes when you compare what you're doing now to what you had previously done, where when you weren't using the coaching model along with your traditional skills that you
Absolutely.
developed as a therapist?
Absolutely. Um, I think because I'm holding people accountable for their own well-being and really kind of setting the tone right in the beginning of my expectation of the goals from our sessions is for you to actually get better and for you to actually become a more resilient and stronger human being in your own beliefs,
Mhm.
right? And who you are, how you carry yourself, how much you love yourself, the compassion that you develop for the self. So yeah, for sure, the coaching component has completely changed the practice. And I still get messages from some clients of like, you changed my life. And obviously, as humbling as that is, it really does speak volumes of
Yeah,
the approach is actually working,
that's amazing.
right? It's not a hand holding session. I am not a
Mhm.
hand holder. So
You used two terms before that I would love for you to define for the listeners and explain what they mean.
sure.
Trauma focused and relational wounds.
Yeah. So essentially, they're the same. Trauma, one of my greatest teacher, Dr. Gabor Mate, really talks about little t trauma and big T trauma. And so a lot of times when we think about trauma, we're thinking about wars or natural disasters or those big, really events that create an environment for us not to feel safe. But
Mhm.
really, all of us have gone in connection with relational wounds. We've gone through things in our childhood, in our teenage years, and even in our adult relationships that have left us wounded. And so whether it's we had parents that didn't know how to raise us the right way, there was neglect, there was abuse, what emotional, mental, physical, any of those things, or even if our parents were absolutely wonderful and they were nurturing and kind and loving, we sometimes may have felt as children that we didn't have anyone to turn to when our feelings were hurt, right? We come back from school, someone bullied us, our parents were too busy working and providing a life for us, so we felt alone in our pain. That becomes a relational wound. That becomes a trauma because then we feel so alone, and either in our little brain as children, we think that emotions are wrong and that there's no space for them, or we just kind of hold them, internalize our emotions and never get to process it. That shows up in our romantic relationships later. That shows up in our friendships. Romantic relationships are probably the worst grounds that we can come up with our traumas and patterns, but truly we do. That's exactly where all of our relational wounds come up. And you're just like, oh, who signed me up for this?
So
But
when people come to work with you, is it common for people to not know at first the source of their relational wound? If it was
oh,
something
sure.
like you described where they were a kid and came home and didn't know who to open up to. I imagine that that sort
Right.
of thing might happen quite often, and it might not, someone might not realize that that was the source of, all of the things that happen later in their life.
Right. Absolutely. A lot of people have no idea. Because a lot of times the way we look at ourselves, there's quite a bit of self-blame,
Yeah.
especially in, I'll just, in the Western world, being an individualistic country, we take on responsibility for a lot of our pain and, the imposter syndrome, the perfectionism, all of these things are trauma-based or connected back to some sort of pattern that was created due to a survival pattern that we needed to create, and now it's become a maladaptive behavior. It's no longer serving a purpose. It's now hurting us instead of helping us like it used to. So we don't know where the connection is. We just come into session like, oh, I'm a perfectionist. I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't overcome it. And it's
Uh-huh.
really causing a lot of issues. And it's like, okay, what happened? Where is that coming from?
And like, how long does it take for someone to heal from something like that?
Honestly, sometimes not long at all.
Huh.
Some people a few sessions, some it depends on the wound, obviously, and the severity of it. Some people a couple months, and some wounds, honestly, like for example, for myself, and if you don't mind me sharing personal
No, go
stories,
ahead.
and thank you. So when my mom passed 10 years ago, that really changed me quite a bit because she was such a big part of who I was and how I defined myself. And so having that person leave my being basically really made me turn inwards and look at myself in ways that I'd never looked at, right? It raised my self-awareness, but then I had to face a lot of trauma wounds. I had to figure out what I needed to heal. And even though my mom was a wonderful mom, wonderful woman, she still left me with some traumas. Whether it was me observing my parents' relationship or whether it was me observing her as a woman and how she showed up in her life. In that observation alone, we pick up behaviors that are, again, maladaptive. And it's no longer something that can survive, let's say, in today's world. It's no
Mhm.
longer
Mhm.
functioning. So those are the things that will kind of carry through the span of life because sometimes they're dormanted. We don't notice them. We don't see them until it becomes present. And it's like almost like offered on a platter to us. Then we're like, oh, I didn't know I still had that. Right.
Uh-huh.
So it really depends on the trauma. It depends on the patterns that's coming up. And again, the word trauma sounds really scary, but it's not. It's just the hidden pains. As Dr. Gabor Mate says, it's not what happened to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of that. So what happens inside of us? It's internalized emotions. It's that unprocessed emotion. And when we talk about internalized emotions, and the reason why I started my practice working with women, because a lot of women internalize emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all very, very good at that, whether it's taught by us by our, female generations
Mm-hmm.
passed down through that, or it's by society or culture, whatever it is, we're really good at internalizing emotions. And it's absolutely devastating for us.
That I completely agree with you. And it is interesting that females tend to do that because we are a group that tends to be community builders. And
Hmm.
so, just logically, I would think that, well, yeah, you would share what's happening because
Right.
you built these communities, but that's not actually what happens in practice.
Very true.
Um, does everyone have trauma?
To an extent. Yeah. And if we don't want to call it trauma, relational wounds, we
Okay.
do. Even if you look at it in depending on our parents' relationship,
Hmm.
especially if our parents were together or what we observed as relationships. If we want to like just connect it to the romantic bonds that we have, what we observe as children, whether it's a healthy connection between our parents or tumultuous or somewhere in between or disconnected, we pick up cues in that. And that becomes our kind of blueprint of what relationship will look like. Or we say, God, I never want to have a relationship like my parents. But in order for us to get to that never, we end up role playing some of our parents' dynamic in our romantic relationships.
Huh.
So if you look at it through that lens, yes, we all have relational wounds because we repeat patterns that are unconscious.
That's fascinating. And so you need to repeat the pattern or replicate what you're seeing to try to break free of it.
Mm-hmm. To learn it, to learn the lessons, and yes, to break free from that trauma. Some people don't have to. And honestly, that's why I'm so passionate about relational wounds and therapy, because it's like we don't have to go suffer through every relationship in order to learn and grow. Can we look internally to heal the relationship with ourselves so that we don't bring in these unhealed traumas or wounds or whatever we want to call them
Right.
into our relationship? Then we don't attract those things because we mirror someone else's trauma. So then we're attracting their trauma patterns so that we can heal our own trauma patterns. It's
So
very
interesting.
complicated.
It
Yeah.
sounds like it. What happens if relational wounds are left unaddressed, untreated?
A lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of self blame and shame. As shame is probably one of the heaviest emotions that we can carry throughout our lifetime. And that actually ignites depression and anxiety. Shame is probably number one emotion that ignites that within us. Because the narrative that's around shame is so heavy and debilitating for most of us, that we continue to live through that. We continue to wonder why life isn't working for us or why we just never feel happy, or there's just that like nagging thing in the back of the mind or even the heart, that you can never really open up your heart to be in the space of fulfillment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think what you're saying is so on point about shame being debilitating. I work with victims of different types of abuse, and shame is a word that's coming up a lot in
mhm.
cyber abuse cases right now.
Yeah. Oh,
And it's hard for people to work their way through experiencing that type of victimization because there's so much stigma in our society around that on
absolutely.
top of what they're already feeling. Um,
Absolutely.
Uh,
To your point on
mhm,
that, if I may share
mhm,
something, and one of the reasons why I got in this field and really the specific work that I do now. Um, a lot of these individuals who are going through these traumatic events, the shame that you just brought up, sometimes when we have a safe space to go to, that shame gets reduced quite a bit.
hmm,
Right. If we have, like we were talking about, if we have someone that we can turn to that can listen to us, to truly hold that space of feeling heard and seen, and then kind of taught how to go back into our own internal safety, that makes a huge difference. For me, and I don't consider myself a victim. I experienced, you know,
mhm.
child sexual abuse when
Sorry.
I was younger. Thank you. And I share this because for me, I think what didn't cause the trauma internally for me was because I had a mom that immediately took action.
Mhm.
Right? She listened, she believed, she, held me in that safe space. And she immediately took, both my parents did. My mom was the person that I went to. And that made such a big difference for my child brain to say,
Right.
okay, what happened to me wasn't my fault, and
Mhm.
it's okay.
And it's okay to speak up about it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Sorry that that happened. Uh,
Thank you.
I think I
Sorry.
had shared with you prior to this interview that I have represented children, and it was always really heartbreaking to see kids who had experienced some type of abuse and then for their loved ones to not believe them. And part of that may have been out of an effort to self-protect and try and, deny that something is happening within the family, but it causes an added layer of trauma then
For sure.
when a kid is not believed. Um,
Absolutely.
Within the Thriving Women Institute, how do you work with clients? What does it look like? Is it individual sessions? Is it group sessions? Is it both?
Yeah, I do both. And for the individual sessions, depending on the financial situation for the client, obviously I want everyone to get help. But usually I do a package deal with
Mhm.
individuals and even the group, just because there's a form of commitment that happens with clients when they do commit to their own well-being. So that's kind of the change to what from a traditional practice where it's hourly pay. But yeah, I offer individual, and it's usually a 6 month period for us to work through whatever it is that they're coming in with, and
Mhm.
we dig deep, we peel through those layers, and we're suddenly in conversations that wasn't even planned. So we do the work. It's not easy, but it is so rewarding at the end of the day to come through the other side and really be proud of yourself for the work you've done. And then I do women's feminine healing group and masculine healing group separately, both for men and women, in ways to not only focus on healing their relationship, but also connect together and create a
Mhm.
community to never feel alone in their pain and their situation. And those have been really successful, and people love them. There's friendships have come out of these groups, which is stunning to me.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so those two have, so I do the work with men in the groups, not individually.
Okay. I see.
Yeah, and for men, it's a little bit easier to be in the groups than in individual sessions because they do connect differently when there's other men's that share the same emotions, right,
Right.
as they
Right.
do, because we're not they weren't taught as society to because of our society to express those
Mhm.
emotions. So when
Mhm.
they hear someone else say it, they're like, oh, thanks for giving me permission to talk about this.
Yeah. And I mean, the beautiful thing there is when I've had a conversation with someone else recently about this actually, and about men
Mm,
not opening up and being silenced because that's what's expected of them to kind of just be strong and
for
push through
sure.
things on their own. But the beautiful thing is that I think people can inspire one another. So when one
Yeah,
man it serves as an example for others, there's kind of a ripple effect there.
it's so true. Beautifully said. I love that.
Thank you. I'm curious, how do you take care of yourself doing the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Honestly, that was one of the first things I learned in graduate school. I had a professor that was like, Kahila, I can tell you're super sensitive. You need to be able to leave work at work and go home with it. So it was something that I trained myself to do. I love being outdoors. I love nature. I'm lucky enough to live near the oceans. So walking on the beach, just listening to the waves is one of the most therapeutic things for me.
Yeah.
I've, enjoying time with family and friends. And like just a couple of days ago, I went to a comedy show laughing. So, traveling, things like that, just really tapping into what gives me life. Because, it's that cliche saying, I guess, if your own cup is not full, you can't pour into someone else's. So I definitely focus on that. I give my best in sessions, and after that, it's like, okay, time for me to regroup and reconnect.
Yeah, that completely, that resonates with me. You need to take care of yourself and love yourself.
For sure.
This
Yeah.
has been such an enlightening conversation. I really, really appreciate your time and all that you do. In closing, I'm wondering if one of our listeners has experienced trauma, what advice would you give them if they're trying to figure out, what do I do? What are my first steps to try and address this?
First, be kind to yourself. Whatever has happened to you, you didn't cause it. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to start with, and look for someone that you trust, whether it's reading books and journaling or going in and talking to someone, but create a space for yourself to actually let out the words that have been stuck in your mind and your heart for so long.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the best ways of healing our old wounds. And that's why it's so healing to come in to have a conversation with someone that you trust and who is unbiased.
Mhm.
So I think that's the important part, is to just dump it out. I literally tell my clients, let's have a dump out session. Like, just dump it out. You don't owe your trauma anything.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about it is that when you do actually look at it, when you give yourself the time and space to either talk about it or look at it, to allow it to come out of your system, it no longer has the same power as it used to.
Mm.
It releases the burdens, it releases the power. And now you are able to actually come up with either a solution or the permission to truly let it go. Because there's nothing we could do about the past. It's already happened.
Yeah. So beautifully
So,
said. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Where can listeners find you, or where can they link up with your organization?
For sure. I am all over social media at Kahila Hedayatzadeh. They can find me there. And if my website is available, they can send me an email, contact with me on any of the platforms, and I'd be happy to guide them through anything, even just simple conversations. I always do a discovery call with everyone, a free one, just so I can make sure that we're the right connection. If you are not in the right connection with your therapist or coach, healing will be really, really challenging.
Yeah,
So
I
find
can
me on
imagine.
social medias.
And
Yeah.
we'll include in the show notes a link to the Thriving Women Institute,
Awesome.
and links to your social media accounts so that people can find you. Thank you so much for
Perfect.
being here
Thank you
today
so
and for
much.
sharing all of these insights and for the work that you do.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you for joining us on Rights and Remedies. I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights into the legal issues facing victims and the pathways to healing. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Whether you're a survivor, an advocate, or someone looking to learn more, we're here to support and empower you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. You can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at ALM Law LLC for updates, resources, and more. Until next time, take care and remember that together we can make a difference.